Okay, I promised you a bit of a discussion and sort of review of change over time now that you have had overview lectures and readings about the 16th, 17th, blah, 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 the 16th century, the 17th century, and the 18th century. So um, I will try to do that here. And ideally, I would like for you to pause the video and write down things and think about things as you go, and draw from what you remember. So, the periodization that we're talking about, first of all, remember that periodization is in some ways it's not arbitrary, but it's flexible. It responds to particular priorities. And so I want you to think about, why has this periodization become the way that historians have thought about and divided up this colonial era? What is it emphasizing? What are the changes? What are the significant changes represented by this way of breaking up time? In other words, what aspects of society, what political or economic or cultural processes are highlighted by periodizing, by these particular eras being distinctly divided this way, and what processes and experiences and aspects of society are are diminished or are not highlighted, or might actually require a different kind of periodization if we were to move them into focus. So that's just something to reflect on. So these are the standard periodizations that historians have tended to use, excuse me, for this colonial era. Most of the 16th century we talked about as the formative era. There's the early conquest period, and then the rest of the 16th century, in which conquest or contact and colonial rule is a gradual process and spreads throughout the place that we now call Latin America. So that's the formative era. We tend to think about that as primarily happening in the 16th century, a little bit of the 15th century, starting in 1492. So 8 years of the initial early conquest era that is primarily focused on the Caribbean. And then the rest of the 16th century we think of as the formative era. The long 17th century we have talked about as the Baroque era. And what we mean by the long 17th century, in some instances talks about the sort of the very end of the 16th century, but certainly all of the 17th century, and then into at least the first 30 years of the 18th century. We talk about it that way because we're talking about the establishment of, or we're talking about the kind of processes and the look of society in what we think of as established colonial society. So we're talking about a time that's post-secularization processes. Remember what secularization means: the handing over of power from religious orders to diocesan clergy. It does not mean the removal of religion from society in any way at all. So, but it's post-secularization, post to a great degree encomienda as being an important institution of power. You've got an establishment of different kinds of court systems, etc. It's also the time when the concept that we talked about as lo barroco is flourishing. There's reasons why we call it the Baroque era. You might want to review that. So the long 17th century is the second era, the second period that we're talking about, and we call it the Baroque era. And then the 18th century, especially the second half of the 18th century, is what historians talk about as the Bourbon era or the Reform era, the era of reforms. So I want you to now pause the video and describe for yourself on a piece of paper, perhaps, or if you're in the room talking to somebody, what is the flavor of each of these eras? How would you describe aesthetically, in terms of a kind of, what's the vibe? What's the flavor? What is life like? What is society like? What are the kinds of descriptive words that you might give to describe the formative era, most of the 16th century, the long 17th century, the Baroque era, and then the Bourbon era or the Reform era, the 18th century, especially in the later part of the 18th century. So pause the video, take a little minute to just describe what's the flavor? What is the vibe? What does it feel like? What does it look like? When you come back, here's some things that I want to mention, but I want you to think about how many of these things showed up on your list, or if they didn't, how they relate to what you wrote down. So the 16th century can be described as an era of urgency, of dramatic change, of the beginning of the establishment of colonial society. On the Spanish side, we have apocalyptic fervor. It's an era of both crisis and certainty. It is an era of, of an insistence on certainty. There are millenarian ideas that are motivating colonial action and infusing it with a particular kind of theopolitical vision. There are visions of a Spanish Rome, of the fulfillment of the Roman Empire, a Christian Roman Empire with Spain at the helm. A particular kind of Christianity is introduced because it is the mendicant friars, the Franciscans, Dominicans, etc., who were given charge of the conversion of indigenous people and given charge of indigenous towns and indigenous parishes. These were clergy folks who had not previously been pastors. They had been dedicated to contemplation. Now they were in charge of creating community and missions and churches. Um, this was a time in which everyone was supposed to become incorporated into this new part of the Spanish kingdom, this new part of what was eventually to become the Spanish Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. There was the language of making sure that everyone was in shot of church bells, within earshot of church bells, was something said all the time. It was an era of incorporation. It was an era of great learning. It was an era of exchange of information between indigenous elites and missionaries. Spaniards were arguably learning far more than indigenous people were simply because of the discrepancy in numbers. It was an era of introductions and changes. There were visions of a new world at this time. It was an era of expansion, of literal expansion of the Spanish Empire, dramatically so. In Latin America, there was established two republics, the idea of indigenous people as perfect or perfectible Christians, or the idea of indigenous people as eventually understood as permanent neophytes in the faith, so very imperfect Christians. But the debate about what kind of Christian they would be, what kind of human they would be, was very much alive in the 16th century, at least in the early 16th century. It was the idea of the early church all over again, the idea that this was the new Israel, the new promised land. There was all kinds of hope from the perspective of colonial religious visions. It was also the era of enormous destruction, the enormous destruction of of sacred texts, of histories, of towns, um, of sacred sites. It was an era of devastating epidemics in which enormous numbers of Native Americans died in really vast numbers in horrible ways and in a short amount of time. Nonetheless, it still was the case that indigenous people remained the vast majority throughout the entire colonial period. The long 17th century, from the perspective of Spain, things had not turned out how people had imagined. So you have the spread of pessimism, of imagining new places to explore. The triumphalist view did not hold. We have wars and loss of territory in the Spanish Empire in Europe, economic depression in Spain. We have fears, we have assertion of kind of rigid authority. In Latin America, the two republics don't stay put. There's a rise of fear about disorder and the increasingly large population of mixed people. Remember the notion of imperio mixto, which was a kind of imagined mm, zone of life and people and aspects of culture that didn't fit neatly into the two republics, people who were out of place, people who were not behaving the way that they were supposed to behave, poor Spaniards, wealthy people of African descent, women who did not have husbands or male authority to keep them in the homes. This whole fear of this kind of chaotic imperio mixto was something that Latin American elites, colonial elites, and also people in Spain involved in colonial rule spoke about. Out of this kind of fear and pessimism on the Spanish side, but also out of a growing autonomy, vibrancy of local economy in Latin America, and a growing sense of identity that was American born, a celebration of Latin Americans as being the inheritors of this European tradition, as well as a kind of romanticized version of Native Americans and the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire. Being born out of both of these things, this kind of fear and pessimism and an assertion of authority, but also being born out of the kind of creativity, assertion of American identity, an understanding of Latin America as being a place of mixtures, etc., was born a vision and a version of Latin American Baroque that celebrated mixtures and contradictions, that you can see the ways that architecture and art and style of religion and authority um, looks different than European Baroque. And so Latin American Baroque is talked about by Latin American intellectuals at this time as an expression of a true kind of Latin Americanness. Lo Barroco is meant to represent this kind of mixture. So you can also see this in the ways that judicial jurisdictions, judicial authority is organized into multiple and overlapping jurisdictions. The 17th century is the height of judicial power. Executive power is not so strong, but you see it in the visual landscape, in the ways that people perform religiosity as a celebration of chaos, a celebration of the combination of light and dark and oppositions. Then you move into the 18th century, and it is an era of reform in which all of these things are challenged. Streamlining, rationalizing, modernizing, attempts to curb excess, both economically, economically, politically, culturally, etc., to modernize, to impose order. In Spain, this is a time of dramatic loss of the remainder of Spain's uh, European territories, so that the colonies are the only territories that Spain has outside of Spain itself, and they become much more important for economic reasons. But the French monarchy that inherits the crown after the Habsburgs have no heir to pass that on to. And after the War of Succession is completed, that 14-year war in which the treaties require Spain to give up its remaining European territories, but also establish that the two crowns, Spain and France, will be forever separate, even though the Bourbons were a French monarchy. Um, the Bourbons institute all kinds of reforms. They start instituting that in the very beginning of the 18th century, but they really start to have an impact on things like the relationship between the church and state, on Native American communities in Latin America in about 1750 and especially in 1770, 1780. But you have a, a, a whole different idea of the way that authority ought to be represented: more executive, less judicial, more streamlined and ordered jurisdiction and division of jurisdictions. You've got, in terms of art and architecture um, and religiosity, you have an effort to modernize, simplify, to focus more power in the individual authority of the bishop, the individual authority of the king, etc. You have an introduction of all kinds of new bureaucrats and inspectors. But in art and architecture, you have the removal of saints. You have an effort to kind of make things less chaotic, less dramatic. Festivals are limited, the number of saints are limited, etc. These things have an impact on women and Native Americans, and they have a dramatic impact on the Creole elite, the colonial elite. There grows to be a great tension between um, the peninsulares, the Spaniards coming from Spain. There enormous numbers of Spaniards are coming from Spain now, but they're envisioned as a kind of reclaiming of the colonial Latin America, a second conquest. And they are an army of bureaucrats. This is not a military conquest. And there's an attempt to transform people's way of life to make it more rational and modern, etc. Okay, there's my whirlwind tour of the eras and that sort of change over time. What I would like to invite you to do is to use this whirlwind tour to now fill in the gaps. Go back and look at everything you read. Go back and re-listen to the lectures if you want, or look at the lecture notes and sort of plug it in. Make for yourself even a kind of timeline that helps you orient the different flavors of these different eras, and then ask yourself how you might reperiodize um, these eras. If you think about the books that you read, if you think about Jennifer Hughes, if you think about Karen Grobart, if you think about Bianca Premo, and soon, if you've read ahead, if you think about Margaret Chowning. Um, there may be future classes that hear this video in which you didn't read those texts, so I apologize. I try not to use those kinds of specific details in these videos, but those are all great authors that you can read if you haven't read those things. And still, that sort of whirlwind tour, I think, will be useful in whatever class you're in. Okay, thank you.